All right. So welcome. This session quickly recaps our interactive songs project so that we can then have conversation with a special guest and then with attendees. And as Greg said, this project, this work is supported in part by an NSF grant, our project SMILES, which stands for Student-Made Interactive Learning with Educational Songs. And it's focused on introductory statistics, and we'll explore later what parts cut across disciplines. Here's the project's URL that you also saw in our abstract. And here are some other links for your future reference. It'll be archived, so don't worry about copying them down right now. And also, here is a URL that has a full-length archived workshop about the project so that now we can do more of an executive summary to get to the good stuff. So our earlier study in Journal of Statistics Education inspired us to explore the idea of interactiveness. And so through the SMILES grant, we created 24 statistic songs where in advance we solicit student inputs that become part of the song that's played back to them. And the songs are now all publicly available now that we've concluded the experiment, which I call the SMILES trials, to assess their effectiveness. So the inspiration for these interactive songs is the word template game Mad Libs. And it turns out the Mad Libs approach has also been adapted for educational use, such as in teaching statistics, where David Trumpower gave examples and the rationale that students will care more about variables that they come up with and not jump to quick conclusions since they know the whole context is being made up. And some other inspirations for interactive songs are these, and you can explore them later if you wish. So here are the criteria that the SMILES songwriters aimed for. We wanted to make the song short, flexible, relevant, and pedagogically useful. And it turns out that rhythm and melody had the constraint of ensuring intelligibility of the synthetic voice that would sing the free response inputs that we could not predict the students were going to come up with. But songs can be interactive even if they're not in the SMILES style. So we considered some why nots along the way. So one of them was, well, why not just have students complete each rhyme? Sort of like the fill in the blank that Tom showed us, right? So here's an example in blue, an excerpt from my correlation song. Are points near a line or far? What's the correlation? Everybody, R. If the fit supports a line, its slope and R would share the sign, you know. So you can imagine students completing the lyric in real time. But again, as Tom mentioned, this structure kind of limits what can be assessed. It limits the rhyme scheme. So there's limitations of how conceptual you can get with this kind of structure. Also early on, I was asked, well, why not just show the full lyric as students fill in the blanks? And there's certainly a place for that method. Some people use it. Some people, some teachers that are focusing on reading comprehension use something called a cloze test. Cloze is spelled C-L-O-Z-E if you want to Google it later. It's where students fill in blanks from like a word bank. But we felt that anticipation of our method would draw them in, just like all of you are now on the edge of your seat wondering about who is our surprise guest and what is he or she going to do. And I believe there's a new thing called musology that I think makes students answer math questions before they get to see the math song videos. So, and as you can see in the excerpt in blue from the same lyric we just sang, you know, if a term appears in the lyric later, it could give away a blank in another part of the lyric. So the R is in the lyric already in red, so that may give away that that's going to be filled in the first blank if they saw the whole thing. So that was sort of why we didn't go in that direction. We were also asked, well, why don't we, you know, we were asked about why do we use original songs where students wouldn't already know the melody? And these were some of the reasons why we didn't parody existing songs, at least not already in the public domain. But this why not doesn't really address interactiveness, so I'm not going to dwell on this further. Another why not we were asked was, well, why not take some of the many completed statistic songs in the CauseWeb collection, which is now up to 170 songs. You should check it out if you haven't already, and turn them into interactive songs retroactively. Well, we did that a few times. One example of a song where we did that too was my 10-second ditty called What P-Value Means. I'll just do it, it's 10 seconds. It is key to know what p-value means. It's the chance with the null you obtain data that's at least that extreme. And so highlighted are the three keywords or phrases we identified that we wanted students to come up with on the front end, namely null, data, and at least. And so we had these questions to prompt them to do that. So here's the prompt that got students to choose the word null, and then that revealed the next question to get students to choose the word data, and then the next question got them to choose the phrase at least. And then the student gets to hear the song and see the lyric highlighting their answers. So that's basically kind of like, in a microcosm, kind of how SMILE-ifying a song would work. However, the bad news is that most existing songs can't readily become SMILE songs for various reasons, as you can see. So that's why we ended up really doing most of them from scratch, where the songwriter at the time of writing really had in mind that the song was going to be an interactive song. Because to do that, a song needs to have built-in flexibility to change even the surrounding lyric to accommodate the unpredictable length of a free response input. For an example of that, look at the top of the slide. Notice in the second line of the first verse, there's a short one-syllable input word, height, followed by the phrase, is high or when it's low. But in the second line of the second verse, suppose you get an input that has 2 or 3 syllables, like mileage. So the rest of the lyric now gets shortened to just is high or low to make room for that. So it requires you to think very carefully about the line as a whole and not just the actual input. And of course, where the input goes to make sure the rhyme scheme is preserved is another feature. If you look at the bottom verse at the bottom of the slide, Chicago household incomes is one of many acceptable inputs to end line 3 because the rhyme scheme has rhymes at the end of lines 2 and 4. So that had to be thought about up front in advance. So I coordinated a very talented and diverse outside songwriter group. Each of these folks wrote 2 or 3 SMILE songs. And one writer, one of these, agreed to be our special guest. So welcome, Greg. So before we look at 2 of your biology songs to discuss the extent to which they could be made into SMILE songs after the fact, and therefore look at transferability or across STEM areas, maybe we shouldn't because if we're running a little late, but I'll give you the chance if you want to briefly make a comment on the trade-offs of students contributing inputs before the reveal versus seeing the whole lyric as they fill it in, since you've now experienced both ways of doing it.
All right, can everyone hear me now?
Yes.
I see the mic lighting up in green. Okay, so right, so the question was about students filling in keywords either without seeing the lyrics or seeing them in the context of the whole song, right?
Correct.
So yeah, so this was really interesting because the way that Larry and Dennis and John set this up is it's sort of like a quiz, and then the answers to the quiz get inserted into the song, and the students, I think, know that the words will be inserted into the song, but they can't see, how those answers are going to be used in the song. I'm delighted that they tried this approach out, and it's interesting because it's not how I would have done it, which isn't to say that I'm right, but for me, the joy of involving students in the creative process is they can feel like they're contributing to the song itself, kind of in the way that Johnny Berliner was talking about before. So I don't know. I don't want to be too prescriptive about this, but yeah, that was one thing that I wondered about. Will the students feel like they're contributing creatively to the song?
Okay, fair enough. So let's dive in. We'll take these songs one at a time. With the song on the left, Cranial Nerve Functions, when I looked at that, I found myself thinking, okay, I imagine students could be asked in advance to match the 12 nerve numbers with the nerves and maybe even classify each one as sensory, motor, or both. but then the real payoff would be having them type in like a short free response phrase describing each nerve that would form that red stanza, where there's a lot of flexibility of the actual words chosen, and it doesn't look like there's necessarily even a strict rhyme scheme. A lot of people don't realize that songs don't have to have rhyme. Look at John Denver's Annie song or John Blackburn's Moonlight in Vermont and so on. What are your thoughts about how that song can be SMILE-ified?
Yeah, so I don't know how much people know about the cranial nerves, but basically there are 12 nerves that connect to the brain directly rather than going 12 pairs, that is, that connect to the brain directly rather than connecting to the spinal cord. And so you can look those up. You know, each one has certain functions in terms of facial muscles, facial sensory information, and so forth. And so this was a song I wrote to try and capture the function of each of those nerves in a few syllables. But as you said, Larry, there's no real rhyme scheme here. So those syllables could be opened back up and the students could attempt their own summaries, their own concise summaries of each nerve. The other thing I should say here is that this song is written based on 12 pitches. Each pitch corresponds to one of the cranial nerves. So the top pitch cranial is representing cranial nerve 12. And so the phrase moving your tongue is sung in that highest, at that highest tone, moving your tongue. And then you go back down to your back and your neck, your back and your neck. That's cranial 11 coming down the scale. Parasympathetic stuff, saliva and taste. That's, you know, so it's, the pitches correspond to the numbers of the nerves. And so that's, you know, that's the key to the song, not the rhyming. So if you follow me there, those syllables like moving your tongue, you know, any other student summary of cranial nerve 12 could be substituted in there. So it takes a little time to set up the song and how it works with the tones, but I could imagine blanking out those phrases and letting the students fill them in.
Sure. And that's a nice example of prosody, which we'll hear Monty talk about later today. So the song on the right, Levels of Organisms, Cells to Organisms, I was imagining that students could be asked in advance, maybe a pre-question where students first put in order the hierarchical sequence of cells, tissues, organs, organ systems, but then the real payoff would be having students give examples of each of those, like the words that I put in red, where again, there's no strict rhyme scheme to follow. So, you know, instead of cardiovascular, maybe they might choose respiratory, and instead of a beating heart, they might say a breathing lung or something. But then I thought, but these three inputs would all have to be linked together. So I guess you need like a data bank where, you know, that they're choosing, you know, one from the tissue column, one from the organ column, one from the organ system column, and they have to be a correct triple, so to speak, so that you can know that it's correct. And I don't know if you would like, if they would need hints to do that or not. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I like the sort of choose one from each column if they need a little more scaffolding, a little more help to know what the options are. But just to back up for a sec, this is basically a rap, a very short rap. So it goes like this: cells form tissues, but tissues form organs, but organs form organ systems, but organ systems form you. And so the part is where a student could fill in an example of a tissue for the first line. Cells form tissues, myocardium, you know, tissues form organs. And then what's an example of an organ? They have like 1.5 seconds to fill in an example of an organ. Organs form organ systems, and then they have a second to fill in an example of an organ system. So that's the idea. It's kind of like fill in the blank, because there's not much room to fill in things, but at least there's more than one possible answer. So there's a little more flexibility in that sense. And so I guess that's one of the ways in which rap can be useful is that in some ways it's a more flexible format with more room for students inserting things where they aren't necessarily locked into a super specific meter and rhyme scheme.
Mhm.
Sorry, I don't
Okay.
know if I actually answered your question.
Yeah, sure. Let me go a little bigger picture now, because like on the poster, you had some thoughtful comments about things that transfer or don't transfer between the STEM disciplines. So, you know, ideally, this session would also have examples of physics songs and chemistry songs and so on. But because of time, we just picked biology songs, and I mean, we picked you because you were in the project too. So it was a double duty selection there. But what is your sense for whether or not if this can work for biology? Would you say that it could just as reasonably work for any STEM field?
Yeah, I think, you've outlined the approach well. And so I think it can work for anything with a couple of caveats. I think for me, in some ways, I'm a really fussy songwriter. And so, I will, slave over every word to try and make sure every word is the way I want it. And so people who employ this approach need to loosen up a bit, because you need to make room for multiple possible student answers. And so my neuroses are working against that, but maybe that's good for me to try and loosen up a bit. And then you just have to accept that everything is a trade-off. So for example, normally we like those end rhyme positions to highlight key vocabulary, but that's just not something that necessarily works with this format. We have to sort of put in those blanks, in the middle of lines or wherever they fit. So we don't necessarily have that particular advantage in this format. But I certainly applaud the attempt to, give students some input, some freedom to contribute to the song, and to think critically, so it's not just guessing the rhyme. So I do think that's good practice in critical thinking. But I would love to hear what other people, people like, say, Walter, who's used a lot of songs. I don't think he's done this sort of thing before. Do people like him, Mary, really everyone in this conference, can they imagine themselves doing this? Because I'm just one guy.
Tiffany says, I definitely can.
Yeah, I'll bite to that. I can tell you that what my challenge would be to create like that knack of creating those songs that would fill in a similar setting. But I think it's definitely applicable to any subject. And I think I think sometimes where people get hung up, where Greg, you have a really good voice. I'm not a singer. I'm sort of an entertainer. And I think that's where, different people could collaborate, where I could say, hey, Greg, can you sing this for me? Or, hey, John Chase, can you make a rap? Or I need someone to play an instrumental here. And I think that might be the biggest hang up, but I think it can be applicable to any subject in the world.
Walter says he's curious about having students supply words that rhyme with key physics words. So perhaps not unlike the Google spreadsheet structure that Tom gave us. So that's interesting. Yeah, I could see that being used. Some words will be easier to rhyme than others, I'm sure, but.
I remember John talking about how he would have the kids or whatever, he could have them give them a whole list of things. And then from that whole list of things, he made up a rap or a song from that. So he kind of did that with the kids' responses.
Mm-hmm.
So, Larry, that is the end of your presentation, correct?
Yeah, so we can go into general Q&A for both presentations now.
Great. So questions for Mary, questions for Larry.
Or anyone quite contrary.
Yeah, please type them in. And Walter has one for you.
Oh,
Larry.
so no, not all of the, some of the inputs are free response where they are typing it in into a blank where they literally could be typing in anything. And you know, we check them for spelling and profanity and things like that, but they really could be typing in anything. It's not just selecting from a fixed drop-down menu. But some of them are fixed drop-down menu when there's really, you know, only so many possibilities they could reasonably choose from. And again, the URL that I gave earlier in the talk of the, there's a like 70-minute workshop that was done online where we really walk through the whole process. I mean, the website itself, as you can see, causeweb.org/smiles, you can go right to it, watch the 3-minute introductory video, and then just start playing with the, for each of the 24 songs, you can click build a song and do the interactive part first. Or if you want to go straight to the final product that the composer had in mind, you can go to the finished song. Either way, whatever works for your instructional purposes.
Hey, Larry, would you quickly type that? Oh, wait, I'm sorry. It is right there. I see it right in front. It's just the general CauseWeb.
causeweb.org/smiles. That's the address for the project.
I will tell you that I've done it, and it is phenomenal. So if anyone has not tried it, I would highly encourage you to play with it, because I had something about, I picked like horses and I don't know, something else that was crazy, like a haircut. And it actually made a song that it inserted those items as different variables. It was pretty amazing.
Thank you.